lastly, and kicking off Peacestock's panel today, and I can't think of anybody better to do it, who I've been involved with in a number of different forums and mediums over the years, and it's been my distinct pleasure, is Brittany DeBarros. And she has been active across so many elements of the movement, right? However we define that, just touching on everything. She came to About Face Veterans Against the War, which is when I first really got in contact with Brittany, with a diverse mix of business, military, and nonprofit leadership experiences, all of which cemented her deep passion and commitment to intersectional movement building work. And she lives it. I mean, I will say she lives those values. And she deployed to Afghanistan for a year in 2012 and has worked on economic and racial liberation issues in various capacities since returning. And I think that that's probably an understatement. She's particularly passionate about leveraging her experience as a psychological operations officer to center narrative and behavioral change in campaign strategy. She is, of course, based in New York City, Shaolin, Staten Island, my old stomping grounds. Somehow there's a big About Face connection on the North Shore of Staten Island. I take a lot of pride in that. Brittany, thank you so much for being here and for kicking off this panel.
So much, Danny. It's such an honor to be a part of this. So thank you all for having me. I'm really excited about the topic of this, about where we go from here, because I think that this is a really pressing question in this moment. And so, I think some folks are used to me giving these like rally-oriented, rousing speeches, and that is not what I have for you today. I have a 10-point list that I have cultivated in my own practice of self-critique and assessment of where we're at as a movement right now. And from where I'm sitting, what I can tell about what we need to be investing in disciplined ways in order for us to develop the peace movement or the anti-militarist movement that of our dreams, and that I think we need and deserve. So thank you for that introduction. I will say, just to model, I'm on occupied Lenape territory. It is an honor to be in relationship with the Lenape people through various Staten Island organizing. That is a thread. That effort is one that's new for me in my own decolonial practice, and I encourage others to think about how we incorporate that. And I'm going to weave kind of a discussion of my own journey around understanding colonialism and the way that that relates to militarism as I discuss these 10 points. So, number 1. More organizing, less mobilizing. So I think when I talk, folks who have been in this struggle for decades get frustrated with me. And I understand. And I keep trying to, as kind of a young buck in the movement, I try to continue to grow in the ways that I can be in right relationship and respectful of elders, and also tell the truth about where I think that we're at right now and what I think is holding us back. And for a long time since I got here, I've seen in the anti-war sector in particular, more than other sectors of the movement that I'm a part of, that we have an exceptional legacy of like an incredible amount of mobilizing around particular manifestations of violence, whether that be domestic or abroad, around, all kinds of issues with all kinds of demands. And that is incredible. And I think that we should, that kind of mobilizing and activism, I think always needs to be a part of things because it energizes people. It has the potential to give people hope. It raises our visibility so that folks know that we exist, which is important, particularly for this movement that is this sector of the movement that is often kind of like not seen. For me, growing up, and then even in the military, and then years after the military, I had no idea there was an anti-war movement at all. And I was involved and active in anti-racist struggle. I was active in economic justice struggle. And it just kind of, it is case in point that I never even saw us. So this is not a case against mobilizing, but I do think that we have to be doing more organizing. And when I say that and draw that distinction, what I mean is that event planning and planning nonviolent direct actions and meetings and all of those things can be connected to base building and connected to organizing, but they are not organizing in and of itself. When I say organizing, I mean base building. I mean, how are we reaching out, becoming visible, and absorbing unorganized people, new people into our movement homes, our organizations? How are we then putting them on a path of deep healing, political education, practice, and skill building that allows them to develop and become leaders in our movement? And this is the reason I say this too, is because it's essential for several of the points that I'm going to bring up. But I think that in the United States, many of us are conditioned in the nonprofit world. When we say sustainability of our movements, people are often talking about resources like money and, all kinds of different things that we need in order to function. And, I think in learning from our comrades across South America, across the global South, I've learned that in their context, resources and finances and all of this are also a struggle. And yet when folks talk about sustainability, often what they mean is, how are we developing clear, competent leaders who are rooted in the knowledge that comes from the lineage and history of the lessons that we've already learned, are equipped with a clear theory of change and vision that is currently being tested so that they can make informed tactical decisions about the interventions that we're making, and can turn around and invest in new leaders that will come up through the movement. I think that one of the issues that we have is that I think is rooted in the culture of colonialism and whiteness that we're all trying to address, is this kind of like rupture between generations. And that affects our ability to really build power, and really, I think, undermines our ability to build the movement of our dreams. And I think that there needs to be healing around that. How do we relate to elders, to people in their kind of middle life, active prime, to youth and young folks coming up into the movement? How are we pulling them in, making them feel valued and heard at all level? And that is a thing that I know all of us probably feel in different ways. And yet I don't see a lot of spaces where we're really having deep, constructive conversations about what that would look like, what we need that to look like in order to build. My second point is that we need to do a better job of attacking the system and naming the system, and not just the symptoms. So the way that I've started what I mean, frankly, is this is connected to the mobilizations thing a little bit, is that we have so many actions about what's happening in Korea, what's happening in Venezuela, about sanctions, about bombing campaigns, about drones, about domestic militarism issues, about recruitment, about veterans. I mean, there's so many issues. And yet I believe that most of us already hold the analysis that these are symptoms of interlocking evils, right? That, as Dr. King said, the interlocking evils of militarism, racism, and poverty. And there's a lot of ways to talk about that. We can talk about capitalism and a system of economic exploitation. We can talk about gender oppression, racial oppression, and the ways that they relate. And yet, so much of our activism, even when we're uplifting symptoms and highlighting and organizing around demands to address immediate harms, which we should be doing, we fail to point back to the system that is driving it effectively, clearly, and in a way that when new folks see it, they walk away not just knowing, hey, this horrible thing is happening in this country or in our country, but knowing why it's happening and what we can do about it beyond an immediate demand. And so that's why I believe that we need to be talking about that's why About Face kind of adopted its Drop the Mic campaign, Mike standing for Military Industrial Complex, because it creates a vehicle where we're still uplifting all of these harms and all of this violence, and yet we're continuously reminded to point back to the interventions at the heart of the system. And for me, I feel passionate about this point because for me, it's very important. I don't want to be ending these current wars only to be fighting the next wars that pop up, because all it takes is a justification that consent has the foundation of popular consent has already been generated for because we've failed to get at the heart of those driving issues. I want to end that system, and I think that that's what we all want to do. And so I think we need to be thinking about how we talk about these things in a way that is continuously and powerfully pointing at those profit motives, at that narrative work and propaganda that is used to generate popular consent for these violences or make people believe that we need all of these things in order to be safe, and really getting at the heart of what do we really, these systems are supposedly for our safety, for our security, and yet safety for who and security for who? The third point I wanted to talk about is that we need to do a better job of unifying around a theory of change and a vision rather than the lowest common denominator. And this is again, all of this is self-critique. So we have done tons of our own petitions and sign-on letters and these kind of coalitions where the function of the coalition is just for everybody to put their brand on it to signify a broad base of support for a particular demand or a particular issue. And yet so often, oh, sorry, it looks like there's something happening on the screen. So I don't know if oh, I see, okay. Yeah, and yet so often I notice that we have really powerful demands, and we might have a theory of change around a particular tactic or strategy that we're having around, a policy or a particular issue area. And yet during this election cycle, it was clearer to me than ever that our sector of the movement has one of the weakest theory of change analyses across the sectors of the mass people's movement that we are a part of. And what I mean when I say that is I believe that all of us believe that these interlocking systems, we understand the connections between these interlocking systems. And really quickly, in About Face, one of the ways that we teach the relationship between those systems is we kind of call it the house of oppression. So often we address militarism as if that's, as if all these systems are kind of on the same plane. And yet I think it's important to acknowledge that the point of all of these systems of oppression is economic exploitation, and it always has been. Since settlers came to this land and brought enslaved peoples to this land to build this country and unleash genocide on indigenous peoples, it was always about resources. It was always about using bodies, right? And I think that we need to acknowledge that the purpose of all of this is economic exploitation and understand these things through that lens. And then, so if we see that as kind of the roof, the purpose of the house, right? Then we think of it as two twin mutually reinforcing pillars of gender oppression and racial oppression that are upholding and enabling that system of economic exploitation. So racial oppression is based on proximity to whiteness, right? It creates a social hierarchy based on people's proximity to whiteness. And when I say whiteness, it's not actually about color. It's about a political definition that was created specifically for the purpose of creating hierarchy in society and stratification that divides the working class and allows for a ruling class to take advantage of all of us and then fight each other as we're being pitted against each other so that we're punching down, right, at those who are less privileged in that hierarchy instead of punching up at the people who are pitting us against each other. And then you have the other often forgotten pillar that is in relationship with racial oppression, which is gender oppression. And gender oppression, like racial oppression, is a social hierarchy based on proximity to a political definition of what it means to be a man or a male. And again, it's not about what being a man actually is or a biological question of being a male. It is about a political definition of manness and proximity to that, and a particular social order that is created by gender that, again, divides us and works in conjunction with racial oppression in order to uphold this structure of economic exploitation. And then at the foundation, reinforcing both of those pillars are built on it. It is the enforcement mechanism of those hierarchies when the narrative functions of those hierarchies fail is militarism. And militarism is not just the literal equipment or terminology, right? It is a system of philosophies that prioritizes a particular relationship with violence, a particular way of understanding how to address harm, how to create safety, etc. And when those other pillars fail, militarism is the fallback that then upholds and reinforces the ability for the system of economic exploitation or the house of oppression to be upheld. And so when we understand those things, coming back to my point about unifying around a theory of change, we know these relationships exist, and yet so often when we're organizing, we are disconnected from kind of moving as if those systems are related to each other, right? So it's like whack-a-mole. We're addressing this thing over here as if this other thing doesn't exist. And I think that one of the ways that we address that is if we believe that this is true in the system, this house of oppression, then we know that we're working towards a revolutionary scale of change, right? We're not trying to nibble around the edges or modify some policies. We might be doing those things as harm reduction in the present, right? But our end goal is a revolutionary scale of change that restructures this entire government that was based on, that is a settler colonial government that Indigenous nations never agreed to being built on top of them, right? So fundamentally coming into right relationship, addressing imperialism and colonialism requires us to dig deep in the ways that we approach this and actually think about what would revolution take? What would it take for us to bring about revolutionary conditions? And more importantly, what would it take for us to be prepared to win in those revolutionary conditions? And that brings me to my next point, which is number 4, which is to iterate and self-critique. I think that we have a tendency to, in our tiredness, in our burnout, in our all of our things, in our tenderness around how emotional a lot of these issues are for us, to not really have a disciplined and consistent practice around experimentation, around trying new things, around refusing to kind of keep doing the same thing and getting the same results, and to really collectively have a disciplined commitment to self-critique. And I think that we need to get creative, and we need to do more of that. I'm seeing that my 15 minutes are about up, so I'm going to go through these next ones really quickly. And of course, I'm happy to continue to be in conversation with folks in the future, because we're all in this together. I think we also need to have a number 5, high impact, low ego approach to the way that we organize. We need to see our organizations as part of an ecosystem that is trying to build power. And we need to have a power analysis in the tactics and strategies that we are employing. And we need to make sure that those tactics and strategies are not things that are organized around making us individually feel good and feel like we're doing something, that are about building power and confronting power. Number 6 is to center and prioritize Black, Indigenous, people of color leadership and solidarity. I think that we need to talk about what tokenism is and how we move beyond tokenism. So if you're finding people of color to be represented, but they don't have actual power, if you're valuing only the types of knowledge that are valued in westernized, global north, kind of white supremacist cultures, such as, having gone through academic institutions, the written word, as opposed to cultural knowledge, lived experience, etc., then those are things that we need to be talking about and addressing. We need to care about catering to the margins as much as we cater to the center. Often we're like, well, we have to meet people where we are. We need to be accessible. And that is true. And we should care at least as much about that as we do about alienating Indigenous communities, alienating Black communities. And for one example of that, right, is if you wave 1,000 American flags at your event, you might meet the center better, but you might alienate a lot of Indigenous folks who, for them, that flag is a symbol of their oppression, of their ongoing colonization. And so these are things that we need to be taking into consideration. Number 7, unite the poor. Someone who I really look up to, Nijmi Jarinko, says every day that we aren't organizing the working class as a class, we are losing ground. And that does not mean class reductionism, as if identity politics does not exist. Whether you like them or believe them or not, they exist. They are about power and the way that power flows through identity. And when we allow them to be conflated with tokenization, we miss the opportunity to really do the deep healing and organizing around addressing identity-based power and oppression in our spaces. Which brings me to point 8, we need to practice liberation in our spaces. We need to practice accountability and healthy boundaries, but accountability also doesn't mean do what I say, and transformative justice doesn't mean do what I demand. It is a deep practice of interrogating the way that we address harm, center healing and transformation. Number 9 is that we need to stop using the master's narrative tools, particularly around nationalism. It is useful, it is effective, and it is short-sighted. When we uplift nationalist narratives that basically reinforce this entire system, remember it's a philosophy of militarism, we ultimately are effective in appealing to people's emotional sensibilities in the short run, but we reinforce narratives that undermine our ability to really get at the roots in the long run. And number 10, dare to complicate. We have to be willing to hold contradictions and get our hands dirty and not be caught up in these like individualized senses of moralism, but be willing to, again, be rooted in power, be rooting in our willingness to be complicated and nuanced about the way that we're moving, and using all of our tools at our disposal. That means acknowledging that even Marxism can be colonial. That means acknowledging that while the two-party system we know is the tool of the working class, that we need to be contesting for political power directly and gaining ground, not ceding that ground, and being nuanced about the way that we approach these things. So I know I'm over time. Thank you so much for your patience with me and for having me. And I'm so excited to be in this work with all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. And I don't think that I could ever criticize anybody on going over time. That would be a very pot, kettle, black scenario. So, well, you know, I think that there's so many directions that we could take a discussion on what's next, right? I mean, what now? And I really like that you provided sort of a list and some serious recommendations, because it is a lot easier, and I'm very guilty of this, to point out holes in a system, right? To be a critic, and then folks will say, well, what's the solution? And I think that there's an enormous amount of value in that. And that's the hard part, right? That's the hard work. And I think why a lot of folks don't really want to engage with it. And so I want to thank you for doing that and for leading off, which never makes it easy to follow. I usually like to go first, so there's just no competition, you know, there's nothing to live up to, but thank you again.